So welcome everyone. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Noting though that it is a webinar, so you may be joining us from other areas of the state or country. And if you are, I just also want to pay respects to your elders past and present. Those of you that have been on webinars with me before have probably heard me say this already, but I'm just very grateful for the Aboriginal community controlled sector's response to COVID-19 and kind of really, making sure that we're protecting communities and the elders within those. So I think that was an extraordinary response that we saw from them and something we can probably really learn from. So welcome to WACOS Wednesdays at 1. This is what we hope will be a free ongoing weekly webinar series, maybe not always weekly, about key topics facing the community services sector in WA. And in this first series, we've been inviting input and engagement from our members and the broader sector about what a really inclusive recovery plan looks like for Western Australia to make sure that we're leaving no one behind. Each webinar features a presentation from WACOS and some of our key partners, and after that we have some opportunities for questions and conversation. So after the presentations today, we've got the breakout rooms being used, so I just encourage you to have your camera on and for now, in terms of Zoom etiquette, be muted, but hopefully later on you'll have your microphone on and be able to participate in that conversation. So for this session, sorry, a few more people joining us. So for this session today on social enterprise, cooperatives and impact investment in recovery, we're joined by Sven Stempers and myself. So kind of envisage I'm putting another hat on and I'll speak after Sven. So some of you may know that in my substantive role, so I obviously work closely with WACOS and love doing that, but I also am one of the executive directors of Impact Seed. And so I will speak a little bit about impact investment and the role for impact investment in recovery. And Sven will speak before me around social enterprise and cooperatives and the opportunity there in recovery. Before we kick into it, we will make these slides available. That is often a question that I get asked first off in the chat. And so we'll make that available, as well as any interesting conversation that happens in the chat, make that available to you afterwards. And while we're speaking, if you can post any questions that you might have into the chat, particularly while Sven is speaking, I'll find some nice ways to interrupt him and ask the questions as we go. So actually, if we can go to the next slide. Amazing. So just to give you a bit of a sense of who we are and who I suppose Sven and I are representing today. So the Impact Investment Alliance of WA is a key reference group and I guess pseudo peak for impact investment across Western Australia. So that group's really focused on improving the accessibility, literacy around impact investment in WA and really works on the finance side of things. The WA Social Enterprise Council very recently launched, I think yesterday, and Sven might talk a bit more to that, is the member-based representative body for social enterprise in Western Australia. And so I'm sure Sven will tell us a bit more about how to be more involved with that. And Impact Seed is Sven and my, I guess, company. And so we are working to build the market for social enterprise and impact investment across Western Australia. So with that, I will hand over to Sven to start to speak to social enterprise and the opportunities there in thinking about recovery. So Sven.
Hi everyone. As Kylie said, we started Impact Seed about 5 years ago to look at building the market for social enterprise in WA. And realised we needed to do a lot of education across sectors, including government, investors, business, and the community services sector around what a social enterprise is. So while it's quite a developed market in other jurisdictions, notably Victoria, the UK's got a very large social enterprise sector. It's really not something that existed in WA before 2015, other than a couple of not-for-profit initiatives looking at alternative revenue streams where they could create impact. So what is a social enterprise? A social enterprise is, it trades in goods and services, so it's less than 50% grant dependent, or it aims to be, if it's a startup social enterprise, more than less than 50% grant dependent. and it reinvests, importantly, it reinvests the majority of its profit into its social or environmental or cultural mission. So the mission is at the front of the existence, the front and center of the existence of a social enterprise. And it could be anything. And we operate in a very diverse very diverse areas of impact. When we look at social impact, there is employment-based social enterprises which produce goods or services, and they look to employ people coming out of the justice system, people experiencing family and domestic violence, all types of people experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage. That is their core mission, and they seek to fill a market gap to trade goods and services to fulfill that mission. So out of trading those goods and services, they want to generate a profit, which is then reinvested in the mission. So if we want to jump to the next slide, we'll look at the different structures that it takes. So on the left, we have a pure not-for-profit that's donor dependent. A lot of these guys, as you would know, are really struggling with donations at the moment because philanthropic giving has dropped substantially through COVID, along with people's capacity to spend. On the other end, we have what we often call the traditional businesses or do harm businesses, or people that exist on the spectrum of just providing a return for shareholders and don't really care about impact. Those, I won't go into too much detail, but those types of businesses often have some community program, but it's really on the fringes, and oftentimes it's much more about their marketing than anything else. The space that we operate in and we're talking about today is very much the one in the middle, where we have not-for-profit social enterprises that have chosen a not-for-profit structure for different reasons, which again, we don't have a lot of time to go into today, but the structure, the not-for-profit structure with DGR status allows them to apply for grants such as Lottery West grants to start up their social enterprises and tap into philanthropic giving. On the other side, we have for-profit social enterprises. Impact Seed has a hybrid of a for-profit and a not-for-profit model. So while we haven't gone for much grant funding so far, we have the opportunity through our not-for-profit entity to apply for grants where there's a charitable and benevolent intent in the project that we're looking to run. And on the for-profit side, we're obviously operating for a profit, but for our mission as well. We will go into co-ops a little bit later, but in and amongst that, we have cooperatives. Cooperative structure is kind of the third and somewhat underutilised structure from a legal viewpoint in Australia. So next slide. These aren't the only five, but this is a lens of what types of impact models exist for social enterprises. So there's a couple of examples there. The first one, the better a business does, the higher impact it has. You'll see a lot of startups in the startup ecosystem in WA and nationally that are potentially tech startups that have a social impact, and their whole model there is the more profit they make, the greater their impact. So higher up, I think, Kylie, correct me if I'm wrong, they're a matching platform that's looking to, is it in the area of disability equipment hire, is that right?
No, I thought it was more employment related, but I could be wrong.
Okay. So potentially not that example. Another one is Climate Clever, which is a local WA startup that's actually partnered with RISE, a community services org. They're all about educating around energy efficiency, reducing household bills, household electricity bills and energy bills for organisations. So they're a for-profit, more profit they make, the greater their impact. Second one, Street, some of you may be familiar with, is a cafe chain in Melbourne. They have a not-for-profit and a for-profit structure they're looking to employ people experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage, particularly homeless people. as baristas and train them up in hospitality type roles. Impact created through the supply chain. Edico is a shoe company that is looking to clean up its supply chain and ensure there's no slave labour going on. You know, when you've got $20 shoes at Target, they're usually not coming from very good places. So Edico is an ethical alternative to that. Profit share, everybody would have heard of Who Gives a Crap. They donate 50% of their profits to build toilets in developing countries. And the fifth example is an equity share, where a not-for-profit or a number of not-for-profits, such as Impact Collective, which we're working with as a collaboration of Rise, Roar and Chorus, are looking to innovate through investment in social enterprises that they are designing, or they've gone out for an EOI to look for social entrepreneurs that are trying to solve for their in the area of their impact. So, you know, things that are aligned with their service model. Next slide. So this is something that we've really been challenged with over the last few years, and I guess COVID has brought social enterprise in as an area of market need for development, where government really needs to get behind it in order to sort of solve for a range of issues. COVID's brought this into sharp relief. The diagram on the right hand side, we can send you the link for the source for that, but that was a report produced by Eunice Centre out of Griffith University, which is a report specifically looking at the role of social enterprises and investment into social enterprises for COVID recovery and regeneration, and they've just done a really nice job of articulating 7 areas for action in order to build social enterprises. So on the left, I've just made a few notes around the business case for government, and I think this is what we advocate for through WASEC, the Social Enterprise Council, and also the Impact Investment Alliance. 80% of people in WA polled want to see more government investment in social services, social housing and renewable energy. These are traditionally areas that are strong suits for social enterprise, and we think they make a very good case for social enterprise models. We know that government spending is constrained with COVID. We know that as we emerge from COVID with the recession that we're going through now, lower tax revenues mean that there's less government money to spend on social services. And we make the case that government needs to find a sustainable middle path that's not dependent on tax revenues subsidising social services, that we actually need to do a much better job of this area between business and philanthropy, or business and the community services sector, where there's business models that are much more community centric, that are often community led and supported by government to get up and running, that target some of these areas of social disadvantage, or at the very least are much more community centered rather than shareholder centric. So next slide. This is just an example I saw a couple of months ago, a very good one. Young people not in the labour force. We haven't seen that level of disengagement for the whole period there, you know, at least as long as I've been alive. And that's quite scary because, as we all know, once you're out of work for 12 months or more, you're much more unlikely to get a job, and certainly of running off the rails with a range of issues, including mental health and all the stuff the areas that you guys are operating in. So can government solve that? No, they can't. In fact, no one can solve it in isolation, but we like to think that social enterprises have an important role to play to reintegrate some of these people that won't be able to find jobs in the future back into the workforce. Next slide. So the tools in the toolkit around recovery and regeneration that we advocate for with government are social procurement. Social procurement is a very powerful tool where government not only advocates for its own spend, such as they've done in the areas of Aboriginal procurement and disability enterprise, but more broadly to all social enterprises, where they don't only advocate for social procurement out of government spend, but where they support social procurement by the private sector, which in a lot of ways is a lot more powerful tool to use in terms of big companies like BHP and medium-sized companies preferencing social enterprises for their goods and services over any other supplier of goods and services. Social enterprise support, we're seeing some support out of organisations like Lottery West through the latest round of grants, which are targeting resilience. I think it comes under the heading of Kylie, is that right? Under the heading of resilience, what are the types of things that we can do to make our communities and our community services sector more resilient? And social enterprise fits very squarely in that. Direct investment by government into social enterprise is called impact investment, and we're looking to unlock that not only through government but through foundation giving and other forms of funding as well. And the outcomes that we're looking for are basically all those good ones down the bottom, which I think no one can really argue with, including relocalising production of things that are currently made in China and elsewhere that we saw being a real weakness in our supply chains through COVID with face masks and hand sanitizer. So the next couple of slides are really just I'll just hash through them because I know we're running out of time. Snapshot of the WA social enterprise sector. So as in the lead up to building the WA Social Enterprise Council, we went out and surveyed the sector to sort of understand what the capacity was in the sector to grow social enterprises and take on funding. We saw that the largest proportion were very early stage startup social enterprises that have been trading for only a handful of years. That those guys need to be supported because they're facing a lot of disruption, as a lot of small organisations are, and businesses indeed at the moment through COVID. Next slide looks at the impact areas that they're operating in. Community inclusion and belonging is the majority there, potentially because it's a catch-all for a lot of very specific impact areas that sort of fit under that heading. But that just gives you a snapshot. I won't dwell on that. The next slide looks at the next slide probably hooks into the 2 slides ago, where we looked at the maturity of the social enterprises, and reflects the fact that most of them are fairly new, and they're either very early stage startups or very early on in their revenue generation, which means that they're either very small and wholly trading, or they're very small and still very dependent on grants. So then the last 2 slides really look at this area of cooperatives, which is the space between a proprietary limited company, which is limited by shares, and a proprietary limited company limited by a public company limited by members, which is the not-for-profit, so for-profit and not-for-profit. A cooperative is a different form of incorporation, and back in the day, they used to be quite popular. CBH is cooperative bulk handling, which is all of the grains handling for WA's I think it's $10 billion ag industry, of which a subset of that is wheat. CBH basically aggregates all of that grain and makes sure that there's an export market for it. They were incorporated as a cooperative. They've since listed on the stock exchange. Very, very large company, is member owned. So all the farmers are owners of CBH. At the other end of the spectrum, there's very small worker-owned cooperatives, such as there's some examples on the next slide that again we won't go into detail to, but happy to answer questions on that later. In the middle, there's businesses like the the Dwelling Up Hotel. Dwelling Up Hotel is the last community-owned hotel in Western Australia where everyone that lives in Dwelling Up owns a share in the hotel. They lease it out to a hotel manager, and then the profits out of the lease fund community facilities like sports ground and kids play equipment and such. Cooperatives normally have to embed 7 values in their constitution, including open membership, democratic member control, member participation, independence, training, cooperation, and most importantly to social enterprise, community concern. So we don't see all cooperatives today, and banks are good, some community-owned banks are good examples of that they're not as interested in community concern maybe as they are in democratic control and member participation. But again, they operate on a spectrum much like the for-profit and not-for-profit entities. So that was a very, very quick 30,000 foot flyover on social enterprise with an eye on the clock. How did we go?
That's great. Thank you, Sven. And yeah, as Sven says, really the intention behind this presentation is introductory concepts to a bunch of areas where we're combining profit and purpose in kind of different ways. So I am wondering, I don't think I saw any questions come through on the chat, but if I missed any, please speak up. And does anyone have any questions now for Sven? And yes, the slides will be sent out to everyone after the session. Yep, for sure. Any questions? If I'm missing you, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask. No? Alrighty. We'll jump into the next side of things. So Ashley, can I have the next slide, please? Awesome. So Sven's spoken a bit to the social enterprise side of things. I'm going to speak a bit to the financing of social enterprise side of things. So in terms of thinking about the role of impact investment in recovery. So next slide, Ashley. So for those that aren't familiar with the idea of impact investment, it's effectively this idea that combines financial return and social return in any given investment. So obviously we have a typo in this slide. Both axes should not be financial investment. Financial return, one should be social return. But if we start in the top right-hand corner, impact investment are these investments looking to maximise financial and social return. So if we go one down, philanthropy is this area where the social return is really high, but there is no financial return, or potentially, you know, depending on where we're talking about impact investment, very low financial return. In the bottom left-hand corner, we've got low impact and low financial return. Well, I'm not sure that's anything that any of us are particularly interested in. And then up in the top left-hand corner, we've got traditional investments, which are looking to maximise financial return, but aren't really thinking too much about any kind of social return or what kind of social impact they might be having. Within the traditional investments, there is this sort of layer called do no harm investing, which is effectively investments that put a bit of a negative screen over investments. So for example, they might not invest in tobacco, they might not invest in fossil fuels, they might not invest in weapon manufacturing. So there are some funds, people, you know, with money investing with that kind of lens that they're thinking about, but that's what we would call a do no harm. That's not necessarily thinking positively or proactively about the impact that that investment's having. Next slide, Ashley. So if we think about the different types of investment, and I've tried to combine a couple of things with this slide here. So we'll start with the elements of investment. So you usually have equity, and this can only be taken on by for-profit companies. And so that is where someone owns a proportion of the shares of the company. The other normal or ordinary form of investment or finance that we see is loans or debt. And that is where someone is making their financial return on the interest rate that you're paying back to them from a debt or loan. And obviously not-for-profit structures can take on that form of investment as well, though they can't take on the equity. There's some other areas of investment that we refer to. So grants can play a really important role in starting to finance social enterprise and impact projects in the early stages. We've also got pay for performance, which I'll go through, which isn't technically a form of investment, but it is a form of I suppose, like grants, a form of supporting enterprises in their scaling. And then you've got blended finance, and blended finance effectively brings together these different forms of finance in new and different ways. So you might have a layer or, starting point with a grant, which might be also supported by a loan, which is quite patient capital and maybe a very low financial return rate. And you might also be looking at crowdfunding or other forms of investment at the same time. So ordinarily, blended finance will combine different kinds of investors, leveraging their different kinds of risk appetites and the capacity that they have for providing different forms of finance. And the point is really to be focusing on the needs of the enterprise and the specific business and layering the forms of capital, so it kind of supports the business throughout their startup and then their growth. Next slide, Ashley. Pay for performance, there it is. I think I speak to that next. So I don't, I speak to that in one moment. So if we have a look at the funding landscape in Western Australia, and this speaks to the previous slide. So in the top right-hand corner, we've got the traditional financial institutions, private equity, or the people who really are those finance first investors that we spoke to on the previous slide. If we take a step kind of down, so the point of those investors or financiers is often that they're looking for very established businesses that are capable of generating a financial return quite quickly. So not usually willing to take on a whole lot of risk. If we go a step before that, so the red circle, these are the seed funds, foundations, and impact investors. So in a sense, impact investors are probably a bit willing to look at the entire spectrum of your business lifecycle, but we've kind of placed them here for these purposes. And then if I pop down to the grey circle, at the very start of your social enterprise's journey, they'll be looking for grants and self-funding. So we often in the startup sort of finance world, we call that friends, family and fools. So they're the people often more likely to support any kind of enterprise, not just social enterprise, when it's first starting out, because they're the people most supportive of the founder. And then oftentimes there's some limited grants, accelerators and angel investors who will help support a business during their really early sort of seed funding stages. The WA Impact Fund in the middle there, I'll come back to. What I want to draw your attention to initially is that we have quite a few financial institutions. We don't have a lot of seed funds and foundations here. And the grants and angel investors that do exist are often only really looking for certain kinds of circumstances where they're supporting social enterprises. So they're quite limited. So our capacity for seed and startup stage funding, particularly for social enterprise in WA, is pretty lacking. And so this is one of the things that the WA Impact Fund and a blended finance fund that we're hoping to build soon will try and plug the gap for. So having said that, WA Impact Fund is not probably that fund. So for those that aren't aware, WA Impact Fund is a fund seeded by 20 mil from WA Super and is looking to invest in 3 areas: social enterprise, but because it is institutional finance, it's looking for pretty non-risky investments, so later stage social enterprise, regenerative agriculture, and clean energy and community assets. So that's the 3 areas of the WA Impact Fund. As I say there, because it's institutional, it's a little bit later stage funding. And so we're trying to look at building something before that that supports social enterprises to get over that initial hump so that they can then go to access the WA Impact Fund or more traditional finance. Next slide, Ashley. So this is a little bit of spot the typos. It's a terrible slide for typos. So if that's what you're into, I'm sure you can find all of them very quickly. The point I want to make with this slide is that pay for performance, particularly in terms of thinking about recovery, is a real possibility. So we've heard a few times from the state government that projects for direct investment in recovery are probably few and far between, given the financial constraints that they have upon them. So pay for performance is a way to kind of get around that direct investment side of things. So social impact bonds, which many of you might have heard of, are kind of one element of pay for performance commissioning or pay for performance contracting. But even just properly contracting to outcomes, which I know is something that many of you will be familiar with, being community service organisations, is a step along the way to thinking about how we might properly implement pay for performance and social impact bond type opportunities. And so if we go to the next slide, Ashley. So this is an example of a pay-for-performance social impact bond. Bonds are actually quite complex impact investment instruments. And so I don't know that I have my work cut out for me in trying to explain that here in the limited time we have. But effectively for a bond, you need quite a complex social issue. And so often, out-of-home care, recidivism are common areas where we see bonds being implemented. So you have the issue, you have usually a government, but you have an outcomes payer, someone who I guess has to expend money due to the issue occurring and is willing to put up some proportion of their savings should that issue be addressed. So in this case, out-of-home care we know costs the system quite an extraordinary amount of money. So New South Wales government is like, yeah, if we can solve this issue, we are happy to put up a proportion of the saving that we will have to us as government to private investors. So obviously, and there has to be an issue also that government is generally, or the outcomes payer is unwilling to pay for upfront, right? So there's a need for capital. So investors put up the upfront money, the program happens. So here it was Uniting Care Burnside, results are achieved, the savings flow through to the government and the government therefore pays the investors back a proportion of what they've saved due to that intervention occurring. So that's a social impact bond. It is, as I say, quite an extraordinarily complex and expensive instrument, and there's simpler forms of doing this pay for performance stuff. But I think it's just worth noting that in this kind of era of recovery, starting to think about, okay, well, of course, direct investment in things is still important and we still need to make sure that occurs. But if we need to make use of other instruments, pay for performance might be one of those things we try to make use of. Next slide, Ashley. I might just leave this one here, actually. So this is just a prompter for organisations that might have a bit of cash on their balance sheet to think. I think we as community service organisations can sometimes think of ourselves as recipients of impact investment funds and not as investors. And I think there's a really real possibility for not-for-profit organisations to think of themselves as investors and potentially, co-investors in social enterprises and look at the kind of return that we can have and the social impact we can have in playing that kind of investor role. Sven, myself and Daniel, who's one of our colleagues, will make ourselves available across groups so we can answer questions as well. But I've just pasted into the chat a link to a Google Doc. We'd really appreciate any kind of reflections that you have from your group conversation into the Google Doc. And I'm just going to you'll get an invitation to join a breakout room. And if you can just join it, and I'll bring you back here in probably about 10 minutes. So there's 2 questions in that Google Doc, and I'll send them through to you through the mechanism I have with the breakout rooms in any case. So you'll get an invitation in a moment. And so please just accept that and I'll see you again soon. Are there any themes that people want to share from their conversations or any questions that have come up for you since having the conversation? Sven or Daniel, do you guys want to share what came out of your conversations?
You're on mute.
Yeah. We only got into the first question, which was, and we were just getting interesting about the definition of social enterprise and whether helping people make money, particularly focusing on people who might struggle with it, but also at the other end has a social dimension. And it was just getting interesting, and we got the little breakout countdown.
Sorry.
But yeah. Like all things social enterprise, definition is always a big topic.
Yeah, totally. I said this in my breakout room as I left them, but I think it's a really good point in the sense of impact investment and social enterprise as concepts really, leverage the current capitalist system, which in some ways has created a lot of the social problems that we have. So, yeah, I think it's just worth noting, and just being cognizant of and aware of. And in some ways, cooperatives with the democratic ownership and the fact that you can't have a majority shareholder is more inherently democratic and social. So yeah, it's just worth holding in the back of your brain. Obviously, we do impact investment and social enterprise, and that's, you know, what we do, but I think it's just worth questioning the work that we do sometimes. Yeah. Any other reflections or questions?
We were looking at the area of investment out of non-impact vehicles for impact, so discretionary trusts. There was a question about multiplier effects in traditional economic models or investment, for want of a better word. So I guess that kind of was just sort of exploring the difference between impact as a byproduct or as a secondary concern versus impact as a primary concern driven by a program logic.
Yeah,
and we had Lucy in the group as well, who I forgot was with Lottery West until she mentioned it in the chat. And I thought their framing around the COVID relief fund, particularly the last round, really addressed the opportunities for recovery for this audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can, if people haven't seen that, we can probably make a link available to the, I forget what it's called, Lucy, Resilient and it's something and Resilient, I'm pretty sure. Something and
She hasn't got a mic, so she's in the chat only.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, we can probably make a link available to people about that as well. Because yeah, I agree, the framing is really great, particularly thinking about the innovative service models and innovative business model stuff. So that might be of interest to some of you as well. Any other reflections? Thanks, Lucy. She's just popped the link in the chat. Oh, you guys are a quiet group today. Well, if there's nothing else, then I will bring us to a close a little bit early. Sorry, Daniel, that I am breakout room 2 for pulling you back in when we didn't have much else. But usually there's a bit more conversation happening in the larger group. So I will make available to you the chat and also the PowerPoint. And in about a week, the video will go up on the WACOS website as well. And if there's anything else that we can send through, just reply to the email when it goes out in terms of the material dissemination. The only other thing I bring to your attention is if you could please have a look at the survey, which is actually on the bottom of the Google Doc if anyone's still in there, but we'll come out with the email and materials. If you are able to just fill it in, it will help WACOS figure out moving forward, you know, how this sort of format continues and in what way and what topics they might address and things like that. So that is everything at my end. I really appreciate you guys sticking around to the very end. And yeah, there's 3 more WACOS webinars. We'll make the link available to you in that final email. So check them out if those topics are of interest to you too. So thank you, Sven. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks everyone for coming.